Hey, so today we're going to kind of talk a little bit about athlete development. Been thinking a lot about long-term athlete development and maybe how we can use that to inform some of the things that we do in regard to training athletes at the college level. I think even at the Division I level here, like at Baylor University, I think we got some developmental athletes, even some of our ballers that are going to play at the next level. I think they definitely exhibit some things that that have the ability to continue to develop. So if we look at some of the tenets from long-term athlete development, I think we can really gather some things and maybe pull some tenets. And, then we're going to talk a little bit about some of just general athletic qualities and developing those different tendencies and different competencies among athletes. So just kind of a brainstorm session. And this is a presentation I gave at the American Football Coaches Association National Convention down in San Antonio back in January. There was a group of about maybe 50 to 75 coaches, variety of high school and small college ball coaches, and some strength coaches in there that worked around the area. But basically, just kind of a grease board session with really not even PowerPoint. Couldn't use the PowerPoint down there, so we just kind of got on the grease board and just kind of brainstormed and thought a little bit. Kind of skimmed through this a little bit, but basically just kind of used LTAD as a platform to kind of think about how athletes are developed around the world, and then maybe how it can inform some of the decisions that we make at the college level. So I think an interesting thing to kind of point out, I'm a habitual podcast listener, so I kind of like to, as I'm driving to work, doing some different things, I like to throw on the podcast. From the AFCA podcast inside the headset from this past fall. There was a high school coach that came on. I can't remember his name. And he kind of talked about if you're not developing next year's team right now, meaning in season back then in the fall, you're wrong. So we always got to be thinking about development, even if we're in the middle of a season, even if we're in a situation where, we don't necessarily have to be thinking development. We need to really always be thinking about development. So that kind of gets me into when I originally made this PowerPoint, it was kind of for a baseball audience. And I just kind of retrofitted it to the AFCA. So there are some examples in here that pertain to baseball. Kind of if we look at athlete development all around the world, it's very different. If you look at the Far East, you can see some different things. And then once you look to the West, it's completely different. Countries like Australia, China, a lot of the sport, especially the national governing system of sport, especially at the developmental youth levels, is really kind of controlled by the government. And that's an interesting way to do it because it allows athletes to kind of be placed. They oftentimes don't really have that much choice in where they go. The government puts them there and it funds it. An interesting thing there, too, is the government funds coaching. So oftentimes you're going to have some really good coaches at the developmental levels and at the youth levels. Okay, so as we kind of go toward the West and the Americas, you see some of that certainly in different areas. In Canada we have some of that, but here in the United States, a lot of times our developmental system is not necessarily sanctioned by the United States. And as a matter of fact, most of the national governing bodies of Olympic sport are not necessarily controlled by the government. They're kind of a little bit more so on the private side. So the issue there then becomes is kind of really what is the developmental system for our athletes? We do have a ton of athletes participating. We have a ton of athletes participating in a variety of levels. And essentially what we do is the guys that stick around and the gals that stick around continue to climb if they're good enough. And the ones that really don't have the ability, they kind of trickle out. So that can be an issue, potentially be an issue, the way we do it. It's certainly one way, but there's some better ways that we could maybe think about it as a whole. So really enjoy being outside. My wife is a park ranger, so we really like the outdoor lifestyle, like thinking about and learning about the outside. So came across this idea when I was thinking about how athletes can be developed, and there's two different methods, if you will, of climbing a mountain: the alpine style and expedition style. So an alpine style, imagine I'm going to work to summit a mountain in one outing. I may kind of overnight once or twice in a small camp or a small bivvy where I'm set up my own tent, but everything that I need is in my backpack. So I park the truck at the bottom of the mountain, and then I go up. And I don't come back, and I don't turn around until I get to the top, and then I don't stop until I get back to the truck. If anything happens, I go back to the truck. It's a lost cause. It's up, then it's back down. The opposite side of that is expedition style. So expedition style is interesting because often done on a little bit bigger mountains. Okay, so it's a little bit more long term. Your Himalayan mountains where it's going to take multiple days, multiple weeks to get up there. Number one, to acclimate to the different altitudes, but number two, it allows us to have different checkpoints to get to. So basically, moving up this summit right here of Mount Everest, our guys would go to different camps. We can think about these camps as being checkpoints. The cool thing here is if I'm at camp 2 and I'm working to camp 3, if something happens there in my development or acclimatization, I just come back to camp 2. I don't have to come all the way back down to the truck. So these little green camps all the way up the mountain can be thought of as checkpoints. We can look at this the same way as athletics. We don't necessarily want to just race to the summit. Okay? And I think that's sometimes it's easy for us to think that we need to do that, especially as soon as we get our athletes on campus. We need to slow cook these guys and get them up through the mountain through checkpoints. So within our current system in the U.S., some things that may be additional concerns is the lack of or the lessening of physical education in the United States. So a long time ago, physical education was a wonderful tool to develop physical competencies that will allow athletes to go in a lot of different directions. So nowadays, physical education in both time and quality is thought to be decreasing. In addition to that, a lot of times physical education is being taught via the games approach. So we're basically teaching activity within games, but we're not necessarily teaching athletes to be fluent in movement. Additionally, if the majority of our elite level coaches are at the highest levels, we need to really always be thinking about who's really coaching our kids. As opposed to other countries where the government funds these developmental positions where coaches can kind of come on and, they're done. They have a living wage. In the United States, a lot of our developmental athletes, especially at the youth levels, are really coached by volunteers. Dads are out there doing some coaching. So you need to kind of think about that. How does that impact? Are the coaches that are volunteering, are they prepared? Do they have adequate knowledge in regard to giving feedback, teaching an athletic skill, assessing an athletic skill, safety, things of that nature? And those are all beside tactical and technical. We didn't even mention those things. So definitely a concern there. Injury prevention, we're going to talk about that here in just a little bit, but if I don't necessarily have the foundation of general athletic abilities, I may exacerbate different injuries and they may become worse. Okay? Think about psychosocial well-being of athletes. If I'm not necessarily developing a stepwise progression along the way, maybe our athletes are not developing fully in regard to different aspects of their social life. Comes the point of specialization and appropriate training. It's an interesting certain point because there are different points in an athlete's career, and it's very sport dependent and where we do need to specialize. The majority of our sports here in the United States, our feet are on the ground. There are oftentimes strength power sports with some speed in there. So I'll put force in the ground to propel me in a direction. I have to start or stop. Oftentimes I'm against an opponent that is working toward different goals on opposing ends. If it's not that, it's a striking sport where I have to make contact with an object that's coming to me, but I still have putting force through the ground. So most of those sports you can think about, in the American setting, we can start to specialize late in high school, especially once we get to the college level. I think early on in an athlete's career here in the States, we're pushing athletes to maybe specialize a little bit more. So you think about the game of baseball with travel ball, with different teams where they're competing all year round. Baseball is an interesting example because it's not necessarily putting them in a lot of different movement patterns. It's a repetitive type game. So that specialization, if done too early, is not going to allow an athlete to reach their potential. Now, it's important to note that there are some sports that may need to specialize a little bit earlier than in the sports that we have here in the States. Any type of sport that's on an interesting implement like snow, ice, or water, those guys typically need to specialize a little bit earlier. Also, sports that have the athletes in the air, so aerials, and maybe gymnastics. You could combine the two, like snow moguls with the freestyle flips. Those guys are typically going to have to specialize a little bit earlier. And then the last area of concern we have on here is just that we want to continue to be a leader in sport. That's important for us as coaches, as people that follow competitive sport. We certainly are, but is our current model sustainable in the long term? These are the questions we need to ask ourselves moving forward. Talked about this going up the mountain a minute ago. We always want to try to slow cook our athletes. Think about, you go to the kitchen, your mom is cooking dinner. There's a couple different things that you can make: a lasagna or a roast. I could put the roast in the microwave, and it'll get done really quick, and it's edible. I can definitely eat it, or I can put it in the slow cooker over time. The slow cooker is always going to taste much better than that microwave. So we can kind of think about that in regard to that training athletes. So when we think about long-term athlete development, it's basically a process from when athletes enter into sport. Most of the time it's going to be recreation sport or being introduced in sport within a school setting. But basically, it's a great way to kind of think about finding a landmark and slowly getting to that point through just a checks and balances system. We use this because we really want to encourage development, not necessarily for competitive athletics, but for just lifelong physical activity. It does create a foundation for athletes. The more sports I play at an early age, the more well-rounded I am in regard to changing directions, handling different implements, throwing, kicking, catching, things of that nature. And then kind of think about this idea of a lifelong physically active lifestyle. So if we can kind of develop great movers early on, it may be to the point where even if they don't make it all the way to professional sport or elite level sport, they may still have interest in their sport and seek to find ways to be active later on in their lives. So you think about the obesity epidemic and diabetes in the United States. Could this be a method of preventative health care where we can help people get active, and then we kind of stay away from some of the issues that we have that are really brought about through inactivity? And then within a coaching setting, it's important for our athletes today to kind of understand what's happening to them in their developmental process, because these guys and these gals are going to be next year's, the next generation of coaches. So if they can have a great foundation through their apprenticeship of observation period, and as they watch the current coaches that are coaching them, they may indeed develop some skills that can really help develop athletes once they do become coaches. So some factors in long-term athlete development would be physical literacy. So you think about physical literacy as, think about when you're learning how to read, phonetics, you're breaking down things, its components, and then over time we put them together, and then, we start to read a paragraph, and then a small book, and then a much bigger book, and then a book that has really high dollar words in it. We can think about movement very similar. Okay, so early on in the age, it's really important for us to develop the ability to do a lot of different things. And they don't necessarily have to be specific to any given sport. Things that like are changing direction, me balancing, running, jumping, throwing, catching, striking an object with a racket, striking an object with a ball, maybe catching a ball with an implement like a lacrosse stick, swimming, dancing, changing weight distribution. These are all skills that are really, really important for athletes to set the foundation for their later on in their careers. So age, when we think of age, we all really often think of, like groups of kids within certain age groups. If I think about baseball, think about the Little League World Series. The Little League World Series is the 11, 12-year-old groups. that participate in that most of the time. But if you look at the look of all those kids, they're all different. You're going to have a guy who's 5'10", 200 pounds, and then you're going to have another dude the same exact age by the calendar that's 5 foot, 100 pounds. You know, the development there is much different. And if we just look at chronological age, that's really not telling the whole story. So you look at these guys here on this picture here, you got guys that are all baseball players, and they're at different developmental ages. They've been around the game much differently. Their skeleton and their musculoskeleton is very, very differently developed because of the time that they've spent in training, the time they've spent just growing up. You think about in regard to that musculoskeletal age, it's important to think about when puberty happens. You know, certainly that changes is very different between girls and guys, but it's also very different between groups of guys and groups of girls. So it's important for us as coaches to keep that in mind. You can also think about just kind of the intellectual and social development of kids. Kids come from a variety of backgrounds. We have kids coming from 2-parent homes, unconventional homes, single-parent homes. You know, kids that have had more of a sheltered lifestyle, kids that have been exposed to a lot of different things, kids that have traveled, kids that have not. You know, the backgrounds of children, it's amazing, you know, amazingly different. So us as coaches, we need to keep these things in mind. So it's not necessarily to change the structure of how we're grouping kids, but it's kind of to put in the back of our mind as coaches, if we can think about those guys in regard to where they are on the spectrum of developmental age, what is appropriate for them to be participating in? What is my practice? What does my training session or competition need to look like to give them the right dosage depending on their age? Now, also with that I can control as a coach is the teaching progressions. Do I need to be a little bit more hands-on? Can I be more verbal? What's the feedback look like? Should I be a little bit more reserved, or can I be very aggressive? Knowing our athletes and understanding the differences in types of age is very important for that. So specialization, we kind of already talked on that a little bit, but you know, certainly dependent on the sport, you're going to have different areas where we can kind of specialize. It's important for us, especially within the game of baseball and the majority of sports in the United States, to be able to handle a lot of different things. So when we think about specializing in the game of baseball, we may try to think about specializing once we get to high school, maybe the later stages of high school. But then you look at some athletes today that are playing Division I baseball, football, and getting drafted in both Major League Baseball and the NFL. You know, you can see that some of these athletes are still out there. Now, understand that these are far and few between. There's certainly the elite of the elite, but there are certain aspects that you can gain from playing multiple sports later on in your career. If we look at windows of trainability, this is really interesting because there are different areas throughout an athlete's career where they can really have a lot of gains from getting exposed to different athletic qualities. So these are not necessarily all or nothing. So if, let's say, I'm not exposed fully to certain areas within this age group, that doesn't necessarily mean I'm not going to be fast. It's just an opportunity for me to experience some development in this area. So let's just take speed, for example, down here in the male group. So this first window of opportunity for males to develop speed exists between 7 and 9, somewhere through there. Now, and that does not mean we're taking them out to the track and doing run mechanics, sprinting out of the blocks, or anything like that. We're just allowing them to and encouraging these guys to find speed opportunities through play. So get out there and run fast, have fun, and really encourage them to enjoy what they're doing. And you can see very similar some of these other different areas. You're going to have multiple windows for speed. Strength comes a little bit lower because of the presence of testosterone and growth hormone as we get a little bit further out in the male population. And you can really see the difference between the female group and the male group, and that is largely attributed to the differences in when peak height velocity or the growth spurt occurs between the two genders. So this is just a little bit more detailed in regard to when these different periods of time exist. This is for the guys period, and this is for girls. These are basically just a little bit more detailed than the chart that we talked about. This is an example coming from Esteban Ballier from Canada in regard for Canadian Sport for Life. This is essentially a timeline that takes athletes from the time where they actually begin sport down here at the bottom in an active start, when they are in a fundamental stage where they become more fluent and developed in regard to physical literacy. So they're obtaining a ton of skills through just unstructured play, unstructured competition, and just kind of having fun, enjoying the game. And then as we get a little bit further up, we start to get a little bit more advanced in regard to the directions we're placing on athletes. So early on in these stages, you're going to have a lot more just play, okay? Not necessarily a lot of structured training or competition. Then as you get to the middle, you ideally have a little bit more training, a little bit more preparation, where we're learning how to prepare, learning how to handle the different stresses of everything that we're doing. And then finally, as we get toward the really top parts here, we're going to have a lot of emphasis placed on competition and doing things like that. And then eventually, as an athlete retires, we would ideally like them to be participating in some form of activity throughout their entire lives. USA Baseball has done a really good job of kind of moving this within their lane and bringing out an idea of LTAD within USA Baseball. There's also been some different areas in regard to USA Hockey and other national governing bodies within the states. This is kind of a little bit more detailed in regard to how much percentage of time should be spent in competition and practice. Certainly interesting to kind of think about here. And then just kind of 5 different stages. Stage 1 at the bottom, we're looking to find enjoyment in participating with friends, the psychosocial development as a youth, a youngster, just kind of developing, and it kind of progresses all the way up to learning how to train, learning how to compete, learning how to win, how to fail, and then finally how we can really excel or progress toward a lifetime of activity and a physical activity that we really want to be around. So with all this, I kind of started thinking about how we can kind of bring this into how we train college athletes and some more higher level developmental athletes. And that brings me back to just the foundational athletic development pyramid. And I think if you look at this athletic development pyramid, it's very simple. We start at work capacity, and this is the majority of this is coming from Al Vermeule's athletic development pyramid, and how he talks about spending different time in different areas throughout an athlete's career. But the first part is work capacity. Work capacity is essentially a foundation. We want our foundation to be much bigger than the top. That foundation is going to allow us to handle the directions, more advanced directions later on in our training and competition. We then move on to strength. Strength is typically moving in external resistance without regard for speed or velocity, and that's going to follow that work capacity. So I'm basically spending a little bit more time moving heavier weights, but I'm not necessarily worried that much about how fast those weights are going, as long as I'm not moving like a slug. As I progress from work capacity to strength, the intensity of exercise goes up, or like the resistance of load goes up, and the volume typically goes down. Moving up to power. Power is somewhat similar to strength, but instead of moving a resistance without regard for speed, we're moving a resistance rapidly. There's 2 different types of power. There's speed strength, which is speed in the presence of strength, and then there's strength speed, which is strength in the presence of speed. So if I think about strength speed first, that may be an example of your Olympic lifts, any types of pulls, or movement where I'm moving a load of, let's say, 65 to 75% of an Olympic weight, Olympic bar weight, like a clean, power clean, a high pull, a clean pull from the floor, anything like that, a jerk, where I'm basically just moving that resistance rapidly. Now, it's important to note that speed does have an important characteristic here, because if I add weight, too much weight, let's say I go to 100%, it no longer then is training power, but moving on the strength spectrum. Certainly interesting to kind of think about as we manipulate. We need to understand, what are we training? Am I trying to train strength, or am I trying to train power? Because if I do want to train power, I need to keep my resistance down, encourage high intent, move the weight rapidly. The other end of the power is the speed strength. That would be moving in even lighter resistance. So your med ball tosses, your sled pulls, anything like that. So it's really, really, really dependent on moving fast. Okay. The next one, speed is often thought of as one of the most precious athletic qualities that we can develop. It's very hard to achieve. On the flip side, it's very hard to get an entire team within this group, or within training speed. When we train speed, we would ideally like to keep the resistance below about 10%. And then finally, our sport skill is basically the cherry on the top. If we can develop our pyramid, our wide foundation, and then we can develop the ability to move resistance, then move resistance fast, and then put all things together and be coordinated and put force through the ground very, very rapidly through speed, it can really help us down the road when we get to our sport skill. Now, unfortunately, most of the time in the United States, this pyramid is flipped upside down, especially at the youth levels. We spend so much time in the sport skill area and not really much time in actually training. So when that pyramid is flipped upside down, we can actually kind of fall up. So when we put all this thing together, we're still thinking about development here a little bit. When we put all this stuff together, we need to first think about how we're planning our annual plan. So us as coaches, we really are prescribing everything for the athletes. So I kind of go through this pretty quickly, but you can kind of see, if we're thinking about an annual plan, it's just a timeline. When our athletes are coming in and when the next cycle begins. The biggest thing is just finding that time. The next would be to locate start and end dates. When are potential areas that may kind of snag us up? So here's an example of college baseball. Our freshmen come in July. Our end of the year, where we are in the College World Series in June. And there's a couple different areas to the middle, like when school starts, when Christmas is, when we start fall training, when the Green Gold World Series are. Putting these things on the calendar can really help me plan the dosage of stress that I'm going to give to our athletes. The next thing we're going to do is, like, what are the periods of time throughout that calendar year? When is my in season? When is my off season? Just simply writing these down on a calendar is really going to help me. The next one is, like, what is my main emphasis? Is it a training emphasis? Is it a competition emphasis? Here at the college level, we're really blessed because we do have clear windows and we're simply training. There's no competitions. Then there's times where we are competing. So when we are competing, we tend to believe that the main thing is the main thing. So we may reduce our volume in the weight room. On the flip side, when we are training, we don't do a lot out on the field. So the volume is low there, so we can improve the high. They are kind of working back and forth. There is a relationship between these two. So then we can kind of think about, as coaches, we're always in evaluation mode. So it's 2019, moving into 2019 school year. What did we do in 2018 that we needed to work on now? So through evaluation, I can look on different skills. Maybe we need to develop better speed. Maybe we were not necessarily strong. Maybe we had some injuries in an area. We can focus time on different areas. So we can develop our next phase of the annual plan based upon last year's evaluation. And we want to put chunks of time. I don't want to rotate through these athletic qualities. I want to spend a lot of time or weeks of time within these different qualities. The next thing is identifying different blocks of time. Blocks are typically a month, or a 4-week cycle. That's going to allow me to kind of progress intensity, progress volume before I move on to a different area. And then I can just kind of split it up a little bit further, and I can think about my weeks. Now, this is really neat once we get here, because once we think about a block, we can think about progressing volume and intensity within the block up and down. Okay, so when we think about looking at that, let's say hypothetically within a month or one block, 4-week cycle, okay, we had 100 reps to give, 100 total reps of anything countable. So your big boy lifts, any squats, pulls, cleans, presses, pulls, anything like that would be factored in here. So ideally, week 1 of a block, we'd spend about 28% of our total volume in it. then week 2, 22, week 3, 35, and then finally week 4, 15. Now, over the course of time, you can kind of see how that allows us to have natural highs and natural lows. And if we group these together, we can have a lot of ups and downs, and then over time, we're going to look like the stock market. So then when we think about just planning a single week, we'd like to follow what we call a high-low split. So the body tends to do best when you group similar athletic qualities together. When we're hot, we need to be hot. When we're not, we need to make sure that we're doing things that are either training work capacity, either training just general strength, or we're working conditioning. Okay, so looking at a 4-day model or a 3-day model, you can see that your high days, and when I say high, it's things that are highly taxing on the central nervous system. So things that are heavy intensity, things that are at a high rate of speed, like speed training, power training, strength training. That right there would be done on day 1, day 3. Then your low days, we would tend to put our auxiliary lift and our conditioning. So when we typically say we're hot, and when we're off, and we're training and conditioning, well, that's our main focus. So the big boy lifts on these days would be your speed work, your cleans, your big squats, and your back post chain work. On your Tuesday, Friday, or day 2, day 4, those may be a little bit longer conditioning set, followed by just general work capacity work. A 3-day model, it may be a little bit different than this. You may have a hot day here, a low day here, and then a medium day. Just kind of looking at how that may be set up across the way in regard to exercise, and we won't go through this all fully, but just notice how day 1 and day 3 are similar. Those days right through there are highly intensive in regard to the central nervous system. Day 2, day 4, there's maybe a little bit more volume, but the intensity is so low it's not going to fully tax the body. And this would be an example of the weight room. Notice day 1, day 3, very, very high. Day 2, day 4, not as much. So now, the biggest thing, in going back to this idea of long-term athlete development, it is all about developing over time. We want to develop an athlete not necessarily just within one off season. We want to see progression over their entire career. Now, that's even before we get them here at the college level. So that's why it's important to kind of think about what we're teaching some coaches. What are we teaching our athletes now who are going to become coaches later on? But once we get them here at the college level, we can really navigate this by giving them appropriate dosages of different types of volume and intensities. So maybe early on in an athlete's career, we're going to spend a little bit more time in work capacity and general strength. As they progress up here, depending on their developmental age and the total time that they've actually spent in training, maybe we spend a little bit more time in speed and power zones, with still touching in strength and work capacity, but the bulk of our training may be designed to improve speed and power. So go back to the idea of coaches. We want to teach athletes how to be coaches. These guys, through their experiences as athletes, these guys through watching us as coaches, they're soaking in so much information. So when they do progress to different types of levels in sport, they're going to say the same things that we say. Their ideal coach, their idea of what a coach is essentially the coaches that they followed and the coaches they had throughout their career. So it's important for us to model positive habits, to have an understanding of how we should load athletes over time. So here we do talk to our athletes, and it may be an informal setting right after a lift. It may be right immediately following practice. But we want to get in front of our athletes and tell them the why. In addition to coaches, there's a lot of different types of careers in sport. There's lifelong activity, there's being an athlete, there's being a coach, there's being a photographer. There's just being a great role model for the community as well. So there's a lot of different times that these guys can be around athletes, and it's really important for us to show them the right way. So, this is we're just kind of talking a little bit today about how we can kind of use different tenets of long-term athlete development in regard to in regard to just training athletes over time. And I think it's really neat. Not necessarily the only way to do it, but it's really neat to help shape thought. So as we're planning dosage of training, as we're planning everything, it's really neat to kind of think about the different areas of age. What does an athlete need? What is an athlete experience? And then over time, how does that fit within my team setting? Definitely enjoy learning about this. Some different areas you can look at. Certainly, long-term athlete development textbook by Esteban Bollier out of Canada. USA Baseball. This is a baseball presentation. USA Baseball's athlete development model, LTAD online. They have an entire book on there for free. Some other things too. Zach Dakin up at Texas Christian TCU, their baseball coach, has a really good book out, Movement Over Maxes, which talks about the developmental system within athletics and how we can kind of train athletes in regard to giving them appropriate volumes of different qualities. So there's a lot of neat things out there to study, and the biggest thing is that we do indeed study. We need to kind of continue to shape our thought and how we're going to develop as athletes, and just kind of go from there. But definitely appreciate the time here, and look forward to continuing this process.